Hi everyone, this is Miss Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us our lecture video on topics 1.4 to 1.7, which is all about our biogeochemical cycles, which we're talking about in class now. So 1.4, this starts with the carbon cycle. This is the cycle in where we see the movement of atoms or molecules that contain carbon between sources and sinks. Some of the reservoirs in where we see carbon compounds occur in that cycle and hold those compounds for long periods of time. And so in that case, that would be considered a sink versus something that holds them for a relatively short period of time is considered a source. Two major fluxes or processes involved in the carbon cycle is our photosynthesis as well as cellular respiration, plant and animal decomposition, and the burning of fossil fuels, which we know quickly moves stored carbon found in the ground into then atmospheric carbon in the form of CO2. Remember, I mentioned before, photosynthesis and cell respiration are key points or processes found in the carbon cycle. Please make sure to take note of the reactants and products found in both. I have seen questions that will ask for those items. So, thinking back to bio, right, we know photosynthesis is performed by plants, algae, maybe even some bacteria. We know that we see it's solar energy, H2O water, and carbon dioxide that gets transformed and changed into our C6, H12O6, which is glucose, as well as oxygen. It is then other organisms that perform respiration and plants as well. Um, they are going to then take in that oxygen produced from plants, consume those plants containing of carbon, break that glucose down, and emit then carbon dioxide, water, and then obviously transfer that energy into cellular energy that they can use. Here is kind of like a bigger picture of our carbon cycle. Make sure that you kind of jot these pieces down in your notes here. We know, kind of starting with number one, we know producers take that CO2, turn it into sugars, right? We said that that's photosynthesis. Those sugars get converted back into carbon dioxide when we see consumers eat those producers, as well as decomposers. Over time, those living organisms will die, be buried, and then form into the ground. Here we can see then over lots and lots of time, fossil fuels can form. So things like oil, natural gas, and coal. A part of the carbon cycle is humans extracting those fossil fuels, bringing that carbon to Earth's surface where it can be combusted. And we see that combustion going back up into the atmosphere. We can also see in the oceans. The oceans is a big part of the carbon cycle as well. And there's an exchange of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as well as in the water that occurs. And that's a really big piece when we talk about in Unit 9 and global change, when we talk about ocean temperatures and ocean acidification. That's a big human impact, a part of the carbon cycle. We can kind of see similar things that we see on land, we see in water, right? Algae are going to photosynthesize, consumers consume them, decompose, they find are then in the sediment of our ocean, and so on. So there are 6 processes that we definitely need to know in terms of the carbon cycle, and I mentioned before that's photosynthesis, respiration, the exchange, right? That's where we see large amounts of CO2 being exchanged between the atmosphere and ocean. Sedimentation. So, this is the very slow process where we see small amounts of calcium carbonate sediment found in the ocean accumulate over years and years. Extraction or the removal of fossil fuels by humans, and then eventually that combustion, right? Releasing the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of burning our fossil fuels. Two major human activities that impact our carbon cycle is the combustion of fossil fuels, because now we're releasing fossilized carbon that hasn't been in the atmosphere for millions of years back into the atmosphere, as well as tree harvesting. We know that trees photosynthesize, they capture tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide. When we chop those trees down, we then increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere because now there's nothing capturing that carbon. Now, moving on to the nitrogen cycle, this is probably the most complicated cycle that we need to know. Um, we can see here that nitrogen fixation is a very important part of our cycle. It's a process in where we see atmospheric nitrogen get converted into a form that plants can actually uptake and use. And so here in our diagram, we've got all the parts broken down. We can see that up in the atmosphere, most of our atmosphere is actually made up of dinitrogen gas, or N2, but that's in a form that living organisms can't necessarily use, so it must be fixed. And so in step number one, that's our nitrogen fixation. So that N2 gets converted in a biotic process into ammonia, or NH3, or abiotic processes like lightning, for example, can convert that N2 into nitrates. The step two there, that is assimilation. So now that nitrogen's been fixed, producers can either take it up in the form of ammonium, NH4, or nitrate, NO3. Next would be ammonification. So this is where we see those living organisms like plants or animals die, decomposers in the soil, and water can break down the biological nitrogen compounds found in those organisms and change it into ammonia. Once again, we have more bacteria, such as nitrifying bacteria, that help to convert the ammonium found in the soil into nitrite and eventually into nitrate. And so plants can take those forms up. And then lastly, how does nitrogen get back into the atmosphere? That's through another type of bacteria known as denitrifying bacteria. They're usually found in very oxygen poor soils or maybe even stagnant water, and they take that nitrate, turn it into nitrous oxide, and eventually into nitrogen gas or dinitrogen gas. Some human activities involving the nitrogen cycle, number one would certainly be fertilizers. The use of fertilizer will add excess nitrogen to the soil. This can alter or disturb the abundance of species found in that ecosystem because those organisms are typically better adapted to those new nitrogen levels and usually will survive while others may perish. Next is the phosphorus cycle. The biggest piece of the phosphorus cycle is the fact that this is the only cycle that has no atmospheric component. We do not find phosphorus typically in the atmosphere. Now, as a result of that, phosphorus has limitations on then living organisms found in the ocean and on land. So, phosphorus is oftentimes a limiting nutrient. Here's quickly our phosphorus cycle. We can see phosphorus is mainly found within rocks, and it is the weathering or uplift of rocks that help to contribute to phosphates found on land and some even in the ocean. Phosphates from fertilizer can also be applied to fields. They can then be moved via runoff and end up in streams or other waterways. The excretion of animals and decomposition also releases natural phosphates back into the ground or water. We see dissolved phosphates can precipitate out of solution and contribute to ocean sediment. And lastly, geological forces such as earthquakes, volcanoes can slowly uplift those phosphate rocks found in the ocean floor to then form mountains. Similar to our nitrogen, a human impact of the phosphorus cycle is the use of fertilizers and household detergents. Specifically, fertilizers can cause things like ecological dead zones as a result of excess phosphorus, which creates algal blooms. And then lastly is the water cycle, or can often be referred to as the hydrologic cycle. This cycle is powered by the sun, and we know that the movement of water changes its forms throughout our cycle. So quickly, we know that it is the sun or solar energy that's going to heat Earth and causes evaporation. That evaporation can happen from surface waters, That evaporated water rises into the atmosphere, condenses, and then comes back down to Earth via precipitation. We know precipitation can take many forms depending upon temperature, like rain, snow, or hail. That precipitation falls on the land, can be taken up by plants, can run off on the surface, or percolate into the soil and enter groundwater to form things such as aquifers. Important human activities involving the hydrologic cycle would be the harvesting of trees, because transpiration or evapotranspiration from plants helps to put water back into the atmosphere. If we reduce the amount of plants, we reduce the amount of water going back into the atmosphere. Also, less trees typically means a lot more runoff, so a lot more flooding problems. Paving land surfaces that are impermeable reduces the amount of percolation, so the movement of water through soil. Also, water diversion, so diverting the flow of streams or rivers, can also alter the water cycle in that given ecosystem. All right, everybody, that's the end of our video. You want to make sure that when you're done, please mark this as done.